Hello all, welcome to this tutorial on lists. In this tutorial we will talk about what lists are, really a basic data structure that's very important in Python. We will also look at how we can create a list. We will look at indexing and slicing lists, and later we will look at some basic methods to manipulate lists. And finally, we'll also look at other basic operations that we can perform on lists. Okay. And in the past, we've looked at simple data types like integers, floats, and strings. Really, list is a continuation of this theme, but it's really a slightly more advanced data structure. You can think of it as a sequence. It's an object that can hold a sequence, or it's an object that can hold multiple data items. For example, if you come down to this next code cell here, you see what is an assignment statement. Here, I'm basically assigning a list to a variable called numbers. And you will notice that list here, it's an object, right? This basically starts with a square bracket, followed by some elements in the list or data items in the list, right? And then close the square bracket. And if I printed it, it's basically going to print me in the list, which is start square bracket 1, 2, 3, and then close the square bracket. So elements, this is a list called numbers with 3 elements, 1, 2, 3. Okay. And again, just like we discussed in the past, just as integers, strings, and floats are implemented in Python as an object, lists are also implemented as an object. Okay, and as I mentioned, it's an important data structure. And if you're familiar with other programming languages, just want to let you know that it is similar to arrays. Okay, but the only difference here is that it's actually more powerful and more flexible than arrays. So in Python, we don't really talk about arrays. Instead, we just use lists. Okay, and lists are mutable. We're going to talk about what this means in a few minutes. All I'm saying here is that I can change elements in a list. Okay, lists can change, and I'll talk about specific examples later. Because you can change elements inside a list, or you can manipulate lists, you want to be careful, because sometimes you may end up doing things that you did not really anticipate. Okay, let's continue with the example we used earlier, where we have an assignment statement, right? That's assigning a list that consists of 3 data items to the variable numbers. Okay, the second statement here is also an assignment statement, creating a new variable called my_list that I'll call myList. myList assigns an empty list to this variable myList. So empty list in this case simply means open square bracket, close square bracket. It's nothing inside, so it indicates that it's an empty list. The third statement here is actually adding myList, right, equal to myList plus numbers. So this statement, augmented operation here, simply means I'm adding myList. This is equal to, I'm just going to show this to you clearly. This is basically my list equal to my list plus numbers. You already know this. Okay, so when I add this two lists together, I'm basically concatenating it. So what's going to be the result? If I run this, unsurprisingly, I can see that it's basically concatenating these two things together, and the value is 1, 2, 3. Okay, and if my list was not empty, okay, let's say I had number 99. Okay, now if I concatenate these two things together, if I run this code again, think about what might happen. Okay, so again, unsurprisingly, my list equal to my list, which is 99 plus numbers. So I'm basically concatenating the elements together, assigning this to the variable myList. Hopefully this is clear. Okay, another thing that I want to show you, just to again make things very clear, what happens if my list is not a list? What happens if my list is a variable type integer. What happens if I try to add a list to an integer? Let's run this and find out. So you're going to get an error message. Basically, you cannot use an integer here. So you needs to be, when you're concatenating two lists together, both of them have to be lists. Okay, so if I rerun this, this is okay now, but before it was not. Okay, so again, I'm going to go back, make an empty list, run this again, so you can see that my list has 1, 2, 3. Please note that when I'm using concatenation, you have to have lists for both variables. If not, you're going to get an error message. Okay, now what happens with this? So I'm using again an augmented multiplication sign here, augmented operator. So I'm basically taking my list. Right now it's 1, 2, 3, and I'm multiplying it by the number, the integer 2. Is this going to work? It will just give you an error message. Let's find out. No, it's not going to give an error message, because in this case, using an integer, right, and multiplying it basically repeats the elements multiple times. That's all. What happens if this is 3? Please note that when I did the 3, my list was this, right? So it's going to repeat this 3 times. Okay, so if I had my list equal to, let's say, 1, 2, 3, right, and then rerun the code, you'll see that it's going to be repeating 3 times. So elements repeat themselves 3 times. If I were to use a multiplication symbol, right, and multiply it using an integer. Okay, so again, basic operations I can do with my list. Sometimes it could be useful, especially the concatenation could be useful when you're writing some basic code. Okay, some other things that I wanted to mention before I move on is that, of course, the list, going back to the definition here, or going back to the description rather, it's an object that can hold multiple data items. Of course, these data items don't have to be just integers. They can be floats, or they can be strings. Okay, and it can also be a variation. It can also be different types of data items. Okay, so let's start from the first line here. So basically, I have, it's again an assignment statement that assigns a list of 3 elements, okay, to a variable called movies. And obviously, you can see that the string, the individual elements in the list are made up of data type string, and each of them happens to describe a movie title. Okay, and so this is one. This is a list that has strings as string data types as the individual elements. I can also have a list that has different data types, right? That can have elements that belong to different data types. So, for example, this variable movie info, MOV_info, has an element that belongs to string data type, has an element that belongs to integer, basically specifying the year of the release. This is the movie name, Big Lebowski, and interestingly, another list inside a list. So the third data element in this list is actually another list. Okay, so a list, the reason why lists are so powerful is that I don't just use a singular data element inside. I can use different types of data elements, right? Data elements belonging to different data types, and this makes lists very useful and very powerful. And we'll talk about some real life examples of how we can use lists later on. For the time being, let's just focus on understanding what lists are and figuring out the basic operations that we can perform on lists. Okay, so moving on, take a look at this variable movies that consists of 3 movie titles, right, as data elements inside a list. So the way this really works, if you think about it, is that Python stores this in memory, and we talked about how integers are stored in memory, how floats are stored in memory, right? So it's basically storing this in memory. And again, if you're familiar with arrays, right, it's going to store them as a stack. So the first element is at the bottom, right? Typically, this element has a value, a numeric value associated with it. I would say it's 0, right? The second element, which is life of Brian, right, has another number associated with it. Third element, yet another different number. And this is a sequential order. So it starts at 0, 1, 2. So if there are 3 elements in a list, the index is going to be, and again, the technical term for this is index. The index is 0, 1, and 2. Okay, again, we have to get used to the computer way of counting. So it starts at 0. So if there are 3 elements, it's going to go up to 2, right? N minus 1, right? For n elements, it's going to be n minus 1. So this is the way we index the elements inside of a list, and this helps us access these elements if I want to just get, let's say, what happens if I want to just get the second element. Okay, really, this has the index value 1. So I can specify this to access the life of Brian, the value of the element in the list. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Let's scroll down a little bit. So now let's look at accessing the elements of the list. If I wanted to print the entire list or all elements of the list, obviously I'm just going to say print movies, okay, using the print function. But if I, on the other hand, if I wanted to access the first element in the list, so I'm going to have to specify the index value that refers to the first element, which is always going to be 0. So if I say movies, the first element, 0. The way I would say this, even though it says open square bracket, close square bracket, I'm going to say movies sub 0. Okay, SUB sub 0. If we print this, it's basically printing 2 print statements. The first statement prints the entire list with 3 elements. The second statement prints the second element. Sorry, in this case, the first element. That's movies 0. Okay, so now I have a piece of code here. What do you think this statement does? Print movies sub 2. This is going to print the third element in the list. So in this case, the third element is meaning of life. Okay, so it should print the meaning of life. So I'm going to say I actually have an incorrect description. So I'm going to say third element in the list. Now, what happens if I wanted to access more than one element? And this operation is called as slicing a list. Okay, so what happens if I want to grab everything up to but not including the third element? So I don't want this third element, I want to grab the first 2 elements. Okay, is there a way to specify this? Yes, and so here I can specify this by saying movies sub 0, start at the 0th element, right? Or in this case, 0 means start at the first element. Okay, it basically says start at index position 0, go up to but not including second position. So 0th position, first position, second position, up to but not including the second position. So it's going to be 0, 1, 1. Okay, so let's make sure this works. If I run this, so movies sub 2, the second index position is right here. It's going to be giving you the meaning of life, and this is basically going to give you slicing. Again, please note that I also have 2 here, but this basically means start at 0th position, up to but not including the second position, which is right here. Okay, so it's going to be Holy Grail and the life of Brian, and that's what you see here. And just the slicing operation ends up returning a list. Please note that as well. Okay, and the book has more information on slicing. I'd like you to review this before class. Okay, what I like to do is move on and talk about accessing items of a list. using a for loop. So let's say I have a variable movies with 3 items. How can I access the individual items? I can actually use a for loop, and it makes it very, very easy. So please note that this is a variable, target variable. For all I care, I can even have this as x, and I say print x. It's the same thing. To make it descriptive, I use a variable name item. For item in movies, print item. So it's basically going to print the individual elements in a list. Okay. A couple other things that I want to add. Maybe I'll just insert a new cell. Okay, below. So we know that movies has 3 elements, right? So what happens if I print movies sub 2? Okay, it's going to print the 3rd element, the meaning of life. Okay, so this is the 0, 1, 2, the 3rd element specified by 2. Okay, the index position 2. What happens if I actually type in movies sub 3? And please note that this list only has 3 items. Okay, so what happens if I say movies sub 3? I'm going to get an error message. So if you specify an incorrect index position, in this case there is no 4th element, so this is index position 3 refers to the 4th element. 0, 1, 2, position 3 is the 4th element. So this list has only 3 elements, so I'm going to get an error message. So you want to be careful about specifying the index appropriately. Okay. Similarly, what happens if I do this? Okay, just to give you another example. So now I'm not specifying the index here. I'm actually doing a slicing operation. Okay, so it says start at position 0, go up to but not including 2, right? So let's print this. So it's going to give you the first 2 elements. Okay. Now I'm going to change this to 3. Start at position 0, go up to but not including. Right. So it's going to be not including 3. That's 0, 1, and 2. Let's run this. So it's going to give you Holy Grail, Life of Brian, meaning of life. So far so good. Now what happens if I say 4? Am I going to get an error message? Let's run this. No, you're actually not getting an error message. So one thing to note with Python is that, again, it's the way the programming language has been implemented in Python. When it comes to slicing, I guess the implementation, it's a bit more forgiving. So if you somehow go over the limit, like, beyond the number of items in the list, it may not give you an error message. But if you are specifying the index, then you're going to see an error message. So keep that in mind when you work with indexing and slicing. Indexing is not as forgiving as slicing. Okay. So again, go back to the book, take a look at slicing and indexing, and work out some examples so that you're comfortable with both operations. It's very critical, very basic to understand, very basic and very important to understanding how lists work. Okay. All right. So I'm going to again give another example. Okay. Going back to the original example we used, variable numbers that's been assigned to this list consisting of 3 elements, 1, 2, 3. Now if I wanted to add, right, a 4th element, that's, let's say, number 4, to this list, right? I want the new variable, I want the variable numbers now to have 4 elements, and the 4th element should be number 4. So how would I do this? Numbers equal to, would I do this? Numbers equal to numbers, which is a list, plus open bracket, close bracket, 4. It's a list containing 1 element, 4. Should I do this or should I do this? Take a moment to think about it. The end result, what I want is numbers, list data type with 4 elements, 1, 2, 3, 4. So should I be typing in numbers equal to numbers plus the number 4, which is an integer data type, or do I do this, numbers equal to numbers plus another list with a single element, number 4? Okay, so which is right? there's only one right answer. In this case, you cannot add an integer to a list. It has to be another list. So I'm going to comment out these so that I can run this and show this to you. All right. So you see that numbers equal to 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, what do you think this statement is going to do? Numbers sub 1. Take a moment to think about it. Is it going to be the first element or the second element? Obviously, it's going to be the second element because index position 0 is number 1. Index position 1 is a number 2. Okay. So if I print this, I'm going to see the number 2, second position. Okay. That's 1, numbers 1. Okay. So now, what do you think this is doing? Numbers 1 equal to 20. So it's basically taking index position 1, that's the second element, 0 and 1. It's taking number 2, right, which we just printed before. And I'm basically saying, I want to change it. I want it to be assigned a new value, 20. Okay, this is allowed in list. Again, let's find out. Now let's print, assign this value 20 to the second element, right, in the index position 1. Okay, and print numbers. And you'll notice that, yes, you can change the individual elements inside a list. And this is partly what I mean, or what we mean that by saying lists are mutable, right? I can change things in lists. Okay. So now what I'd like you to do is maybe review the material we've covered so far, and then think about these two exercises. Okay. So try this before you move on. The second one is slightly more challenging than the first one, but you should be able to do this based on what we've learned so far. Okay. All right. Hopefully you've written those. You've tried your hand at writing code for these two exercises. What I want to do now is basically try my hand at just giving you some basic examples of list methods. Okay, so that we can manipulate the list. So now x equal to 1, 2, 3. Okay, so again, x is a list with 3 elements, 1, 2, 3. Now I want to append 4. So it's basically append method, x dot append, right? Add the data object at the end of the list. Okay, so it's going to add the number 4, it's an object, to the end of the list, which is x. So the x's value is going to be changed. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. We're going to run this in a minute. But before that, let's try to look at another method called extend. Okay. So it's 4. So let's say z is 4, 5, 6, 5. So it's another variable z, which is a list. Okay. Now I am using the method extend, right, on x, whatever the value of x is at that point, and then I want to extend z. Okay, so I'm basically saying add elements of the list z at the end. Okay, and then print x. So again, this should change the value of x. Both methods change the value of x. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's see what actually happens. So I'm going to start at x equal to 1, 2, 3. Let's run the code. So you'll see that after appending 4 to the list x, which is 1, 2, 3, it becomes a list with 4 elements, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And now the new value of x is 1, 2, 3, 4 with 4 elements. We have another list with 4 elements, z. Okay. 4, 5, 6, 5, and I want to extend z to x. X's current value is 1, 2, 3, 4. And when I did that, I already ran the code, right? The x's value changes. It's basically adding the elements of the list 4, 5, 6, 5. And note that z is a list. Okay, it's adding the elements of a list the end of x. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 5. Okay. And the other fun thing you may want to try, maybe I'll just show you here. Okay. If I rerun the code, I'm just going to say y equal to x dot append 4, and at the very end, if I say print y, what do you think the value of y is going to be? Okay, I'm just going to go back here. Let me run this. Just please note, this is important that you understand this. If you happen to assign this to a variable, it's going to have no value, none. So this is why we didn't do it in the first place. It's useless to do this. So we won't really do y equal to, because even if you did that, y is going to be none. So just to, maybe it's not clear to you now, it'll be clear later, okay? Especially when you look at strings. String methods work slightly differently, okay? So again, keep this in mind. We'll come back and revisit this when we talk about strings. Here, when I use a method, invoke a method, right? It changes the value of x. X is mutable, remember that. Lists are mutable. So when I use a method, I change the value of x. Keep that in mind. If you end up assigning this to a variable, in this case, in most cases for lists, it's meaningless. Okay, it's no use doing it, so we won't do it because y's value will be none. That's what I'm trying to say here. Okay. Again, it's not critical at this point in time, but it's nice to keep this in mind. File it away. We'll revisit it a little later. Okay. All right. Now, if you understand this, again, take a moment to think about this. If you understand this, tell me what's going to happen here. Okay. So x is equal to 1, 2, 3. What happens if I do x append, right? 40, 50, right? Try running this. Or is there a difference? This is the same as extend, right? 40, 50. So again, I don't want you to run both at the same time, right? Run one at a time, right? Right now I'm commenting this out. Print x. I'm not going to do this for you. I want you to try to do this on your own to see if you understand the difference between append and extend. Okay, so first run this code, see what the value of x is. Okay, and then comment this out, and run extend and print x, and see see if you understand the difference between the method append and the method extend. Okay, and so these are two basic methods that we use to add a data object or elements of a list at the end. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is basically maybe try to perform 2 additional exercises. The same problem as before. Take a positive integer as an input from the user, and now maybe earlier, we didn't know about append, so we solved the problem using a different way. Now I want you to solve the same problem using the append method. Okay, and finally, second question. Again, this should be fairly simple. This is just for your practice. A lot easier than question number 1 here. Ask the user for a list of 3 favorite movies and then store them in a list. Thank you, and I'll see you soon. Bye.